Hello, everyone, and welcome to Masterclass. We're so grateful for those of you who are here live and in person, and those of you who might be joining us in the recording in the future. Welcome to Masterclass. Today, we are going to be focusing in on choose your own adventure, navigating a career in biotech. And we are so privileged to have our wonderful presenter and master for the Masterclass, Amanda Lucchini. I will now turn it over to Amanda to introduce herself and give us a wonderful presentation and answer questions at the end. And so, without further ado, Amanda.
Thank you, John. My name is Amanda Lucchini. I am a manager at LabCorp, Laboratory Corporation of America. Um, if you've heard of them, it's usually because they do a big chunk of work that's diagnostic testing, but they also have a part of the company that does drug development, vaccine development. And so I'll talk about my work there, as well as kind of what led me to that path. So thank you so much for having me today. Um, a very quick disclaimer, I work for LabCorp. The views here are my own. They're not official statements from the company. So just making sure everyone's on the same page. What are we talking about when we talk about biotech? So really biotech can be anything that is using the science and advances of biology and chemistry and applying that to agriculture, environmental sciences, medicine, medical devices, etc. So using the skills from the sciences and applying them to some sort of improvement out in the world. My experience with biotech has largely been in the medical space, so vaccines, new therapies, medical devices, etc. So that's mostly what I will be talking about today. Hopefully you're here because you've asked yourself the question, what is a career in biotech like? How can I have a career in biotech? And I'll try to offer some of my advice as well as just talk through my experience, how I got to where I am. So, Adventures in Biotech, starting our quest. I'll start with where many of you are, I assume, which is in college. I did my bachelor's degree at Utah State University. I got my bachelor's in biochemistry. So, some of the things that I did in college that were valuable for setting me up for a career in this field. I was a biochemistry major, so majoring in a science, valuable if you want to go into a scientific job. I also had a minor in English. That was just something that I really enjoyed. It gave me some additional writing skills, but was just a counterbalance to the science classes, maybe a little bit more diverse, maybe. I particularly chose biochemistry. I started as just a chemistry major, but at Utah State, biochemistry gave me a lot more flexibility in electives. So that let me take anatomy and physiology. I was able to take a toxicology class, microbiology, some physics courses. So I just personally enjoyed that mix of classes, and it kind of helped me figure out what I liked best. Really valuable to my time. I had 15 lab courses. It was a very heavy lab-based program. I'll talk about that in undergraduate research a little bit more in a second, but those kind of building the early lab skills were super important for kind of advancing my career. And then just having a positive experience. I had a good life sort of outside of science. I won't talk about basketball too much because Utah State just got kicked out of March Madness, and I'm a little heartbroken still. But attending basketball games, living in a college town, just kind of having good friends, I think having that counterbalance that I didn't get burnt out, so that I wasn't sort of down on science, was helpful. So particularly I want to talk a bit about that undergraduate research piece. I think that this is something that if you can have any experience doing research in a lab, it's incredibly valuable to you and valuable to the people that are maybe going to hire you. So I ended up doing research for the toxicology department at Utah State. This came about because I was just talking to a lab mate of mine in one of my courses, and he, about what I liked, what I was interested in, how I didn't really know where I wanted to go. I think I was a junior at this time, and he suggested I go talk to the head of the toxicology department. The tox department at Utah State is pretty small, so it wasn't like a very huge kind of intimidating department head. It was just sort of another professor is what it felt like, which did make it a little easier. But I set up a meeting with Roger Coulomb was his name, and just talked through like what is toxicology like? What does your lab do? If I was thinking I might want to do this, what do I do? And I asked him at the end of that meeting, do you know anyone who might be able to take an undergrad on for research? At Utah State, you could do a semester of like credit for research. And so it wasn't even looking for a job at that point. And he said, oh, let me go ask my postdoc. She might have something for you to do. And so just that intro meeting actually turned into a semester of research and then a year and a half of a paid job for me, which, maybe was a little bit lucky, but I think happens maybe more than people think, that you can kind of have these quick conversations turn into viable connections. So my research in undergrad was looking at genetic differences between commercial and wild turkeys. Wild turkeys are very cancer resistant, but commercially bred turkeys aren't. And so we were looking at genetic differences in their liver. So very different from what you might see like for the rest of my career path. So really in that agriculture space. So I don't think what you're doing research on as an undergrad is massively critical, more just the experience of being in a lab doing that research. You get the hands-on skills in the lab. They're similar to what you might get from your lab coursework, but you get a chance to really kind of do the same methods over and over, refine your skills, that sort of thing. And then you can often get other opportunities. So I was able to have my name on a couple of publications that postdoc did. I was able to go to 2 undergraduate conferences. Utah does a conference on undergraduate research, and there's actually a national conference on undergraduate research that was local enough that year, as well as just do a presentation as part of the kind of internal seminar series at Utah State. So all things that gave me good speaking skills, a little more experience, a chance to see other people's research as well. So as I came to the end of my college career, I was trying to figure out, what do I want to do next? I knew sort of all the things I was interested in probably required more schooling. I knew that I was not interested in medical school, which I imagine is a familiar feeling to many of you if you're here, is that I like medicine, I like science, but I don't want to be a doctor. And so what else is there? And I had lots of things that I liked, but not something that I was in love with. My husband is a physicist, and he is someone who, like, from age 15 is like, I want to do physics. I'm going to be a physics professor. And like, that is what he has done. This was not me. I did not have a dream job. I did not have like a particularly passionate career. And so I was just trying to think of, well, here are the things I like. What do I do with that? So I thought about law school. My dad's an attorney, and that was something that I saw what he did for work and enjoyed. I liked kind of the logic puzzles. I thought about forensics. I thought that was just really cool and interesting and kind of an applied science that was medical without being medicine. And ultimately, I ended up deciding to go to grad school, pursue more research, and kind of take it from there. So that led me to my PhD, which I did at the University of Rochester, and I ended up getting a PhD in toxicology. So I'll pause for a moment. I can't say it's entirely unsolicited advice because John did invite me here, but I'll give you some partially solicited advice. You can Google, how do I get into grad school? What are employers looking for? All these things. So this is just my perspective, having gone through applying for grad school and applying for jobs, and then now being a manager who hires, finding a good match for grad school or really that first job. And I use that word match very intentionally because it does need to be good for both parts. You're trying to sell yourself to a school or a career or a job, but they're also wanting to make sure that they're selling themselves to you. They want good employees too. So things I would recommend you look for. Broad scientific areas. Sometimes people get really, really interested in one professor for a grad school program, or like, I have to work in, brain cancer or something like that. And personal motivations can be good, but you never know, is that professor taking students? Is that dream company discontinuing the project, et cetera? So looking for, I want to work in neurology. I want to work in vaccine development. I really want to go to University of Rochester. Those are great things, but maybe don't tie yourself down too narrowly. Think about the size of a program or a company. My grad school program only took 5 or 6 students per year. It was on the smaller side, and that was just right for me. It was the kind of right level of support, et cetera. I work now for kind of a medium-sized department in a very big company. There are things that I like about that. So think about what maybe works for you with the level of support you want, or the level, what size you kind of like working in. Good reputation, that can be hard to figure out, obviously, but as best you can, talk to people who maybe worked for that company if you can. You can Google it and see if any, what you can find on the internet. I'd take that with a grain of salt. You can look at rankings for schools, but good reputation. Camaraderie amongst the students. If you apply to grad school, you'll certainly get to meet some of the other students on an interview or a visiting day. You don't always, when you interview, get to meet the rest of the team, but sometimes you do. They don't have to be best friends, but look to see, are people happy here? Are they working well together? Does there seem to be a good camaraderie? That could tell you a lot about that work or that school environment. And then things that may or may not be important to you. A lot of grad schools or companies will have specialty groups. So at LabCorp, we have a Pride group, we have women in toxicology, there are, Latinos and veterans and just all these different kind of identity groups. And for some people, that's incredibly important to them that they have that at work. Other people, not so much. So it just depends on kind of what you are looking for and if that's a critical thing for you. And then sort of just specifically for grad school teaching requirements. My program did not have teaching requirements, which was great for me. I wasn't interested in being a professor. I didn't want to teach. So if you're thinking of the school path, is that a pro or a con to you? Things that schools and employers will look for, especially at this level, laboratory experience. Do you have any skills that you can bring right off the table? No one expects you to be perfect in the lab, but have you taken courses that require labs? Have you done undergraduate research? What sort of experience are you bringing in right away? Communication skills, that can be, yes, I've given presentations before, I've done writing, but also just how you present yourself in an interview. If you think you're going to be really nervous or you haven't really had to go through that before, find a way to do mock interviews or practice, because that kind of like, we do like an impact factor when we interview people, which is just, are they professionally dressed, but also, can they communicate? Can they answer the questions? I get very nervous in interviews, so, lots of people feel that way. Do what you can to kind of, just put your best foot forward. Motivational fit is something we look for. If you apply for a job or apply for a school, I can almost guarantee they'll ask you, why this school? Why this job? And saying, I want a career in biotech, probably not going to cut it. Why a career at that company? Why do you want to be at that school? That sort of thing. So think about, why are you applying for that job? It's okay to have answers that are like, it's in the right location, or I want to move here for personal reasons, or things like that. That's still a reason and a perfectly valid one. You're not going to get knocked for that, but think about why. And then have some kind of career plan. To me, as I'm hiring, I don't really care so much about what someone's plan is. I know it will change. I know that the company will provide different opportunities. They'll make different choices. But what I care about is, have they thought about it? Are they showing the maturity to have, thought a little bit further ahead, think about what they want to do? Do they have some kind of plan? So getting back a little bit to kind of my path, why toxicology? So I knew that I wanted something that was going to help human health, that was medical related, but that wasn't, directly medicine. And toxicology provided a lot of really applied science. You have, people testing the safety of drugs. You have people making changes in environmental impact. So it felt like it was going to be really relevant and that it was something I could kind of do with that. And I also just thought it was an interesting field. So my research at the University of Rochester was looking at how molecules that come from omega fatty acids, so fish oils, how they can help reverse inflammation and help repair damaged tissues. So it was a lot of pulmonary and immunotoxicology, looking at lung infection and cigarette smoke exposure and these things. It was a really nice, diverse project. I think any project in grad school probably would be, but I got to work with primary human cells that we isolated from blood donations. I got to work with cell culture. We did some mouse experiments, and then we actually even had some clinical samples, and a lot of just different techniques. Flow cytometry and looking at cytokines and all these different immunology endpoints. It was what I would call a medium-sized lab. So I did 3 rotations, one of which was in a very small lab. It was like 5 people, one other grad student, one of which was this rotation, and one of which was a kind of multi-center project. So it was multiple professors whose grad students and postdocs and lab managers were all kind of together. And that multi-center rotation did not go very well for me. I felt sort of lost. I didn't feel like I could ask questions. It just was not, it was too much independence. It was not my style. I actually quite liked the small lab, and just for a variety of reasons ended up picking this other lab, professor fit and research fit. But it was kind of the right level of support for me. I did have very hands-off advisors, probably a little too hands-off in retrospect, but at the time, that end of the spectrum was much better for me than the very, very kind of micromanage hands-on. One of my roommates had an advisor like that and loved it. She loved having regular, really detailed meetings, having a lot of direction. It worked for her. It would have driven me crazy. If you're not going to grad school and you're thinking of your first job, you obviously have a little bit less of a say here. You can't just pick your boss, but these are still things you can look for while you're applying. Is this a small biotech that's going to have everybody working really tightly as a team? Is this a larger company that's maybe going to be a little bit more independent? And certainly you can ask those questions in interviews, it's the management style, or as you start your first jobs, talk to your boss, this is how I like to communicate. I want to meet this often. My team is very different in how often and how long I meet with them on a regular basis, just because of what they all want and need. And I, as a manager, can adapt to that. Outside of the lab, and I think this is one of the things I would really emphasize, I was able to gain a lot of other experiences. So as you're thinking of your kind of first career steps, just try different things. So I got a chance to chair a conference session. I got to take a couple weeks of a training course at the National Institutes of Health. That was really interesting to look at how government research works, which is very different than anything else I've seen. Grant applications, I got to peer review some papers. I spent a little bit of time mentoring junior students, and that was helpful in that I didn't really like it, which makes me sound like a bad person, but it's not that I didn't want to help them. It just wasn't, I found it hard. I found it like a little awkward, or I wasn't sure how to help them the best. And that was useful for me thinking of like, okay, if I want to be a manager, if I want to lead a lab, how do I need to gain some of these skills? Planning social events, participating in scientific groups. A lot of scientific groups have student memberships or grad student or postdoc memberships that are free or very cheap. You get to learn a lot of research. There's free webinars, and it's like another thing you can kind of build on your resume. So all of this was helpful both for making me competitive in applying for postdocs and jobs and things, because I had all these different skills, and in helping me figure out what I liked. I liked writing the grant applications. I liked reviewing papers. I didn't like necessarily having to do training in the same way. And then live your life. I mean, partially because I would say grad school in particular, and sometimes early stage jobs can be very draining. It's important to have some balance. It's important to have some good mental health. But also the skills you gain in life will help you. So swing dancing, for instance, was a hobby I picked up in grad school, and I ended up helping to like organize a lot of events and plan things. Those skills have helped me in my current job, where there's a lot of rescheduling and moving parts and things like that. So grad school in particular is not the be all and end all. Make sure you have some balance to it. So I did my 6 years of grad school at the University of Rochester, and was looking at what comes next. Where do I need to build up my skills? What else do I still need to do? So at the end of my PhD, I had some personal constraints I'll talk about in a minute. But really, I just felt like I was lacking the knowledge to make decisions. And that might seem a little silly. I'd gone through 4 years of college. I'd gone through 5.5 years of grad school. But I sort of felt like in grad school, I'd been prepared to become a professor, that I had heard a lot from a lot of other professors, from a lot of academics. And we did career panels, we did things like this, but at least the people that I ran into in grad school, it was hard for me to get a sense of, well, what's their actual day-to-day like? They say they work in industry and that's different funding from academics, but like, what are people really doing? What are these jobs like? And so I didn't necessarily feel like I had a great sense of what do I want to do next? I knew some things I didn't want to do. And what do I do next? So I thought about, well, I had considered law school before. Do I go back to law school? We'd certainly heard from patent lawyers and people who'd done kind of scientific law. I thought about biotech, just finding a job at a pharmaceutical company, and that's kind of where I was headed, but I wasn't enthusiastic about it at that point. Do I do a postdoc? Just go get more training, buy myself some time, gain some skills, leave some options open. I was really interested in like consulting. I liked the idea of working on multiple projects and all of that, but I didn't feel experienced enough. I had some little bit of imposter syndrome, and so I wasn't really sure where to go next. So what I ended up doing was a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. So I'm going to pause and do a little bit of just sort of story time for a moment. So how I ended up in Scotland, it was a combination of a strong personal motivation and my one very successful networking story. So my boyfriend turned fiance, now my husband, proposed to me a week before my PhD defense, which I strongly do not recommend. It was very stressful and kind of poor timing, and I didn't want to talk about wedding planning. I wanted to just defend my PhD. But it meant that he and I had been looking at like, oh, we're going to move to the same place. What are we going to do? Long distance. Like he was going back to school. I was looking for a job. So I had been considering all the options on that previous slide, kind of alongside him. But as that relationship got more serious, we wanted to be in the same place. And so he was going back to school and was actually going to go do a master's program in the UK. And so that left me scrambling a little bit and also trying to figure out how can I get a job overseas. I think I probably would have looked for a postdoc anyway. I would have looked for more training. I felt in sort of an odd place to just move into a job at that point. But knowing the visa issues I was going to face, that made some of my decisions. So, I mean, I've said it once or twice. I'll probably say it a couple times. These sorts of things, personal decisions, location, all of that matters too. It doesn't all have to be pure, I must do this kind of scientific path. So my one successful networking story, my PhD advisor had been heavily involved in the American Thoracic Society. So she was an MD, PhD, and did research and medicine. And so we, as her grad students, would often go to that conference. So there was one year where I, had attended a session, had gone to the posters, just was talking to other people. I'd, go through my booklet at the time. I think they have an app now, and search for, which abstracts were most relevant. And there was one where I thought someone had given a really great presentation. And I went and I talked to this guy who was British and just learned a little bit more about his research. It was kind of related to mine. So about 6 months later, planning for the next year's conference had begun, and my advisor really pushed us all to kind of give her ideas. What are sessions we could do at a conference? And so every conference works differently, but this one was one where you had to submit a session with all the speakers picked. You didn't just pick a topic and let people kind of submit abstracts and say, I want to present. You had to sort of have a fully formed thing. So as part of this topic, I had suggested we invite the advisor of the guy I had spoken to at the conference. Her name was Myra White. So we invited this woman. She accepted. She was great. She gave a talk as part of this session. We didn't really stay connected. I think I would see her at that conference, but it's not like I was regularly emailing her. We maintained this connection. But as I was looking now for jobs, this was about 2 years later, I was kind of looking for any British connection I had at that point. Who did I know? Who had I networked with? Who could I reach out to? And it turns out that Myra White had moved universities and was now at the University of Edinburgh. So I had her email address. I'd met her before. I'd invited her to this session. And so I knew her well enough, at least, that I could email and say, I'm looking to move to Edinburgh. Can we meet up at the next iteration of this conference, which was a month or two away? I see you're there. Do you have any, job openings, or do you know anyone who's looking? So met up with her, had lunch, and then she, turns out, had not just moved there, but was like head of this center. And so she went back and was talking to a couple of their colleagues and found kind of a junior, someone just starting out as not a professor, but a researcher who indeed had new funding and was looking for research in an area that was similar to mine. And so we got connected. I ended up being a right fit for the job, and that's how I was able to get this postdoc position. So I tell that story partially because it feels a bit like magic, and I still kind of can't believe that it works out, but really because I think networking can seem like such an intimidating big word. I picture a ballroom where I have to go just meet random people and say, strike up a conversation and know everything about their research. But really, it can be as simple as like when you're in these opportunities, if you're ever at a conference, if you're at these kind of career events, just talk to people, even a little bit, because you don't know if that will open up some door to you down the line. And you don't have to stay best friends with those people, but like as you can, kind of maintain those connections. So Edinburgh for me was quite different than my PhD. It was adjacent to the research I had done, but it worked really as a bunch of small kind of overlapping labs that were part of this big center. So a lot of shared resources. It's actually much closer to biotech than the previous work I had done. A lot of biotech will work like that, where you'll have a few people in manufacturing and a few people in research and development and a few people kind of planning out your animal studies who all have to collaborate together and have project meetings, even though they're working on different areas, or you might have two different therapeutic areas. And so I liked being part of that kind of bigger collaborative culture, even though I hadn't liked that style as much in my PhD. I had very, very supportive mentors, which was great. And it was it was an international culture, which I hadn't had as much of in my PhD, and really collaborative. It was short tenure. It was only a year and a half that I was there for my postdoc, so a different set of skills. But for me, it was a lot of skill growth and a lot of personal growth. I hadn't lived in a foreign country before. I had that terrible view out my apartment window, as you can see, of Arthur's Seat. And really, it was just sort of a good time for those things. So that kind of brings me to the end of my academic career. I'd gone through these many years of college and grad school and a postdoc. And at that point, I finally felt a little bit more empowered in what I was looking for in a job. And so even if you don't go into grad school, the same kind of map could be, high school, college, your first job, and then maybe like, okay, I'm ready to make a career move into something a little more specific or a little bit higher up. So I knew I wanted out of academia. It just wasn't the right fit for what I was looking for. And I knew I wanted to contribute to human health. So something that was a little bit less environmental toxicology, not that that doesn't contribute to human health, something that was more going to make an impact, going to be translational. I also knew I wanted out of the lab. It was perfectly fine, but I didn't have amazing lab skills. And some people really love actually performing all the experiments. I much more enjoyed the planning of it, the assay design, writing, those sorts of things. So I knew I was looking for a career outside of the lab. I had some location constraints. Again, my husband and I, at that point, he was still pursuing school. I was pursuing this career. So if any of you are either in, it can be romantic partnerships. It can also just be that you want to stay in your family. Those sorts of factors, those things come in. And then salary and benefits. I feel like it seems like it's not classy to talk about money, but the money matters. You want to make money, money shows that you are valued. You want to make money that fits the kind of lifestyle you're looking for. And in my case, I knew my husband was going back to school. I knew I was going to be the breadwinner. So having the salary, the benefits, that was also a very practical consideration. I don't think money should be the only reason to pursue any kind of career, but I also think it's perfectly acceptable to say that that's a factor, that that's a thing that matters, and that's okay. You can always ask in job interviews, what is the salary going to be? What are the benefits like? I really try to tell people what the benefits are like, because sometimes that's a weird thing to ask about. So what was next? So all of this led me to applying to a couple of different jobs, finally getting into the biotech part of this. And I joined the LabCorp biopharma company, particularly the immunotoxicology team. So just a little bit about LabCorp. It's a very big company, more than 65,000 employees. It's also a global company. That can be a little bit different working across global sites. LabCorp is a contract research organization. And if you don't know what that means, I'll talk about it in just a second. But it does everything from kind of early stage R&D through diagnostic testing. The immunotoxicology team, this really fit in with my, immunology research and bent. It's about 200 people across 7 global sites. It was 80 people when I started in 2018, so we've massively grown over these last couple of years. And our role is that we conduct lab tests when a therapy or a vaccine is going to affect the immune system. So that can either be because you want it to, if you're giving a vaccine, you want to boost parts of the immune system. A lot of cancer drugs target the immune system these days. Or it could be side effects. You're not trying to target the immune system, but you need to make sure that there's not any kind of reaction when you give the drug or something that's unexpected. So what is life like at a contract research organization? As I said, I hadn't even heard of this until kind of the end of my grad school stage. I'd heard about industry and a couple different things that made up industry. I'd heard of pharmaceutical companies, didn't know that much about consulting, hadn't even heard of this. But contract research organizations are really critical in this drug development path. So maybe you've seen this before, where when a pharmaceutical company wants to develop a new therapy, they'll start by figuring out what they're targeting, screen a lot of compounds, pick their lead, and then this narrows down how many drugs you have dramatically, where you'll end up with preclinical, so in vitro in the lab or animal testing, and then stages of clinical trials. Most pharmaceutical companies will not do all of this in-house. The small ones are too small. It's very expensive to maintain animal colonies. You have to have somewhere that you can recruit human subjects and do that kind of research. And even the big ones, it's just not necessarily efficient. So they will actually contract a lot of that work out. They might do this early stage R&D testing. They might do parts of it depending on the company. And that's where contract research or CRO organizations or CROs come in, where we'll do a lot of this type of work. Great thing about it is you get to work across this whole pipeline, really doing lots of the different phases. I like that you get a variety of different therapies, even if you're a little bit more focused on the assays. So sometimes companies are the opposite, where you're kind of focused in one type of drug or therapy or scientific area, even if you're looking at all the different assays that could support that. We do work under what's called good laboratory practices. So these are regulatory requirements. They mean a lot of regulatory scrutiny, and it can be a very regimented environment. So that's a thing to think about, is do we want to be a little bit more loose in R&D testing? Do you like working under something with a lot of structure? My favorite thing about the job is multiple projects, that I don't have one therapy that's my baby that I'm going to be heartbroken if it doesn't make it through clinical trials. I get to work on a lot of different things, and it's very fast paced. I'll caveat this last one a little bit. CROs or consulting groups usually have a little more job security and stability and a little less innovation because we're sort of at the mercy of what's being sent to that. COVID has thrown some of that into kind of blown that up a little bit. There was sort of lots of money in with COVID therapies, not so much money. So biotech has had a number of years across the whole industry of being a little less stable. I think it's settled down much more last year than it had in 2023. So I'll caveat that a tiny bit. So what is it like to navigate a career path even within a company? I've been at LabCorp for the last 7 years, but I've had 4 different job roles in that time. So I started out just as a contributing scientist, an individual person writing working on individual projects. My job role was to really help plan out studies and then interpret the data. So as I said, I was out of the lab. I'd kind of help troubleshoot assays, but not actually run them. For about 2 years, our team had grown rapidly, so they were hiring more managers. So I applied for one of those jobs. I kept doing what I was doing, but I now had a team of 10 kind of senior scientists, the team responsible for developing new assays in the lab. So they all reported to me. So it was my first time with like leadership responsibilities. A couple years after that, again, just a little bit more growth, and we actually had someone leave, so they were restructuring the department. So I applied for my former boss's job and didn't get it, but by putting kind of my hat in the ring, showing that I was like interested, when they decided to restructure, I was offered this promotion that was sort of halfway in between his job and my job. So at that point, I managed 4 different science leaders. So they now had the teams that I had previously kind of had, these scientists in the lab. So it was a different chance where I was managing managers, which was interesting and a new challenge, and I was a little more disconnected from the lab. But I had more say over various sites. And so who's going to do what? Where are we going to schedule this? That kind of thing. And then about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years now, I relocated. I moved to the Boston area. And so with that, shifted roles again. Had a new team. I now manage the other people that do that same job role, that contributing scientist and the support roles, and a little bit more global footprint. So I oversee 2 teams in the US, in Wisconsin and Indiana, as well as a team in Bangalore, India, and then a couple of different remote workers. So all of this came about just by working at the company, right? Applying for jobs when they were open, taking promotions. It wasn't necessarily, it didn't feel as straightforward as like climbing a ladder as it maybe seems. And I think that that happens a lot where companies will downsize or increase or shift. And so you don't have to plan on applying for a new job every 2 or 3 years to get growth. You can sometimes stick through the same company. Okay, if you remember nothing else from this presentation, or if people are just tuning in, hope they, don't skip this part. The main thing I want to get across is that biotech has a huge variety of careers. I've talked about all the kind of different things I dabbled in, what I went to, and that is just a tiny slice of what's out there. So even just at LabCorp, we have massive teams that do the animal treatment, take care of the animals, work on the clinical side, all of those sorts of things. We have a huge team that does the toxicology pieces. I've moved a little bit away from that. I'm in a specialty group, but there are specialty groups for neurology, for cardiology, for immunology, all these kind of specific endpoint specific systems. Well, outside of those kind of more lab-based science-driven roles, we have a massive number of people that work in technology and systems. This can be everything from AI, and we're trying to figure out how we, use better AI tools. It can be programming for data visualization. It can be just maintaining equipment and like having more of that focus. And we also have lots of people who work in sales or project management. So for us as a contract group, they're going out to other pharmaceutical companies, trying to get them to put their work with us, figuring out what they need. Do we have the right expertise? And then that project management piece pairs with that sales team to keep track of what studies do you need? When do they need to be done? What kind of timelines are you working under? All of that. So these all have science elements. They're all present in the CRO, but they're also present at any biotech. You might have smaller biotechs that people are doubling up. Your program manager might also be your kind of sales contact. At bigger companies, they might be a little bit more spread out or a little bit more specialty. But I've seen people move certainly in between some of these. People start in a science role and then realize they really like the sales customer piece, start in sort of a technology role and want to be a little bit more back in the lab. So there's a lot of different options and you can move, not forever, but you can move between some of these sorts of job roles. Okay, so just the last couple slides, choosing your own adventure. I think the main thing I want to see here, I've said, at the beginning, making a plan, but don't be afraid to remake it and don't feel like you have to get it right on the first try. A lot of these things, if I had gone to a pharmaceutical job and not liked it, I could have gone back for some other training. Or if I had decided I did want to be back in law school, I could have gone back. Again, you can't do that forever. It's much harder to shift 20 years into your career, but don't feel like you have to have your plan set from the very beginning. And there's not necessarily a right map. So I wanted to sort of highlight the paths that a couple of my colleagues have taken. So these are 3 people that I work with. We're all at LabCorp. We are all either science managers or contributing scientists, so very similar job title to mine. So they said it didn't feel that way living it, but I can see how my path looks very textbook on paper. Got my bachelor's, got my PhD, I did a postdoc, I got a job, I moved into management, etc. But that's not the only way to do it. So my colleague Chris, who works at one of our UK sites, got his bachelor's degree and then just got a job at LabCorp, first job out of college, and he has just worked his way up the chain. I would say that's still possible. He's been at the company for 16 years or so. He did have to be really proactive. There are some gaps moving from this lab scientist to a senior scientist type role where a lot of people fill that by getting an advanced degree. He did it by just sort of learning organically and being proactive about like attending webinars and taking whatever education he could get from the company. I would say if you're positive that this kind of like I want to be a manager, I really want to be leading projects, etc., is where you want to be, a safer bet is probably a graduate degree, but it's possible to still do this kind of path. My colleague Brian started out the same way. So he got a bachelor's in microbiology, and you'll see we all got kind of different degrees as well. So that's where there is some, for biotech, your very specific degree doesn't always matter as much. He got a bachelor's in microbiology, PhD in toxicology, and then he went and got a job at a cancer research center. So industry adjacent, like not exactly biotech and that they're not developing things, but much closer to that. And then he moved over to LabCorp and started in the lab, worked as one of those senior scientists developing assays, and then he now leads and manages that team. And then my favorite one of these examples, Allison got her bachelor's in biology and then her PhD and a postdoc, so it seemed like a very straightforward step. But then she spent 1.5 years as a patent law assistant. She then spent almost a year as a barista, and then moved back into academics as the University of Wisconsin, like a lab manager and an instructor there before joining LabCorp, working in the lab, and then becoming a contributing scientist. So for her path, it was partially born as some of those logistic things I talk about. She had a partner who was a couple years behind her in school, so she was a little bit biding her time. Some of it was burnout. She was real sick of kind of science and intensive jobs at the end of her postdoc and patent law and had a tough advisor. And so she just got a job as a barista. She needed a minute and she went and did that and she loved it. And then they moved to University of Wisconsin for his schooling. And so she ended up going back to academia. That seemed like where she wanted to be, and then didn't enjoy it and shifted gears and moved into biotech. So hopefully highlighting that, people who've all ended up at a very similar place took very different career paths. Okay, so my last slide, bit of advice, how to succeed in your biotech adventure. Ask questions, meet people, do that hopefully non-intimidating networking of just talking to people as much as you can. Gain lots of different skills, and I said without creating burnout. You don't have to know how to do everything. You don't have to have 25 different lab skills. You don't have to join every club possible, but do what you can to get some lab skills and also think about the other stuff, the leadership or the writing or, those sorts of things. Look at the big picture when making decisions. Don't base it on just one thing, just location, just money, just scientific research. Try as much as you can to take the big picture. And paired with that, have a plan, but don't be afraid to remake it. You look at the big picture when making those decisions, make a plan, but know that your first job is not going to dictate all your future success. Where you go to grad school is not going to, it's okay to like make a quote unquote mistake or change your mind. And then the last thing I would say is think creatively. You might find that you're sitting there thinking about what is my dream job? There's no way that exists. And then find out that every biotech company has someone who does that. And it's just not something you ever heard about because you don't always hear about these things when you're still in school. It can be a little bit more academic minded. So with that, I will stop talking. Thank you so much again, John, for inviting me. And I am happy to answer any questions you have now or any questions if you think of things after this. I don't know, John, if you'll share my email, but I am more than happy always to talk to you guys or answer any questions.
Yes. First of all, before we jump into the questions, thank you, Amanda. That was amazing. With your permission, which you have just given, yes, if anyone wants Amanda's email, reach out to me. My last name, Foulger at usc.edu, and I can get that to you. To start the questions off, because I get to do this because I run this thing, I do have a question for you. Something that I work with students about. A big question is they want to network with people like you, Amanda. They have questions about what you do, and sometimes they can't come to these events. How is the best way for a person to network with you? Ask you those questions of what do you do, how do you do it? Those informational interviews. How would you want to be reached out to by students, basically?
Yeah. So I'll say a couple of different ways. One, um, a lot of people are decently active on LinkedIn. Not everybody, but you can always shoot your shot there. I have done like career panels in other ways. I'm not the best at LinkedIn, but some of my colleagues are. And that's an easy place to like, if you know a person or like if you attend something like this, that's an easy way to follow up. I would just say send them an email, send them a message on LinkedIn. Have something in mind, like have a question, even if that question is, I'd love to hear more about your day-to-day job, or I'd love to hear more about the kinds of jobs available at your company. That's enough. It doesn't have to be like a deeply insightful question, but saying like, I'd love to connect is tough because like, I don't know what that means. Do you want to just add me on LinkedIn? Okay, that's fine. But like that doesn't really give me much to go on. So if you've been at something like this where you have a name or a person you can contact, you can do that. You also can just, if you know, oh, I've heard of Pfizer, let me try to find someone there. But that's tougher because you don't necessarily know what that person's job really entails. That's one thing. Um, LabCorp has a whole university relations program. We go to a lot of universities and like recruit and do things like that. I don't know if other biotechs always do that, but like attend career days, go to these kinds of webinars, that sort of stuff, because often you'll see people there or someone will have a booth. If you can, the other thing is if you can get to any kind of scientific conference, there are always representatives. So like Society of Toxicology, um, Society of Cancer Research, any of those sorts of things, American College of Toxicology. I know that's trickier. You got to find some, a research advisor or a program or something to like send you. But if it's going to be in your area, sometimes these things run in LA, or if there are, I don't know if like California has undergraduate research groups or things like that. That's a great way to just like pal around and meet people and those sorts of things. So if you're doing any kind of research or if you can get to like a conference or a career day, then that's what I would do. But yeah, even if it's awkward, you can't, I mean, the equivalent of sliding into someone's DMs, right? Sometimes it works out. So like you can shoot people a message. It could just be a little tricky because there's so, I mean, biotech is huge. And so knowing who exactly to contact. But yeah, I mean, I'll give one more tidbit to this very long-winded answer, which is from my perspective, as someone who is hiring, it feels very risky to hire somebody. You invest a lot of time into training them. It's hard to fire people if they're like really bad employees or if it's not working out or those sorts of things. And so having people proactively reach out, even if it's a total stranger, even if I haven't kind of seen them in this sort of thing, is helpful to me. It shows interest, that sort of thing. So we, like people in biotech, managers and that sort of stuff, we don't always have a ton of time, but we want to connect with people. Like it's in our best interest. I would hope I enjoy doing it because I like mentoring people and I want to help you out, even if you never come to LabCorp. But also there is an element of self-interest in that, like it helps us set people up who might end up being great employees, who can make our life easier as managers, all these sorts of things. So generally, if people don't want to talk to you, it's just because they're busy, not because they don't want to talk to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. That's my question. Like I said, Ian, yes. The floor is
Hi,
yours. Unmute yourself and ask your question.
thank you so much. Thank you, Amanda, for your presentation. That was really interesting. I was wondering so I'm a junior studying biological sciences, and I'm starting to do some undergraduate research, and I'm getting to that point where I'm trying to figure out what to do post grad. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more to your choice, um, to entering a PhD program rather than going straight into like the biotech industry.
Yeah. So I think first I didn't know what I wanted to do sort of across the board of science. So I think if I had known that I like really wanted to do biotech or really want to do something pharmaceutical, I think I still would have gone to grad school, but there might have been more of a pause because I didn't have to. Whereas at that point, I was really, really interested in toxicology as a subject, and that's not something you really get so much in undergrad, right? Like I took one elective, but you don't major in toxicology as an undergrad. So that was the big motivator for me, was that this subject was really interesting to me, and that I thought I probably wanted to eventually like run a research group. I wanted something that was like a little bit more ambitious. Master's degrees, um, I think are tricky in biological sciences. There are a lot of places that offer master's degree programs. I think that they are helpful. I don't know that they're always worth the money, to be perfectly honest. You gain skills, they're interesting, but it's not like when we hire with people with master's degrees, it doesn't always get you as big a bump up as you would think. And they're tricky because PhDs are usually funded and you don't get paid much, but you get paid for them, and often master's degrees aren't. So like it's hard. I don't want to generalize about grad school overall, but that's what I've seen is that like we hire a lot of people in with bachelors. We do hire people with masters, but they're not like multiple steps above the bachelors. So it's hard because it's hard to commit to a PhD program. That's a long time, but master's degrees aren't always as beneficial as they might think. So yeah, for me it was really I wanted a research area that I hadn't really gotten into in grad school, and that I wasn't sure if that would be academics or if that would be a government job or something. So I felt like I for sure needed to have more school. And then I knew that I was going to want a job that was a little bit more scientifically rigorous, that was more research, that was those sorts of things. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
We had a question come in, Amanda. Have you ever considered, or would you ever consider kind of splitting off on your own, starting your own kind of company?
Yeah, I have thought about that. I'll say I personally don't know that I could hustle for clients. It's a part of the job that like I greatly respect our sales team because that is not a piece that I personally would enjoy. But I did look at like consulting firms, and I have talked with other people who are kind of independent consultants, and that is a part of the job that I do personally like quite a bit. Um, it's tricky. You kind of have to have a certain level of experience that I don't quite have yet at this point, or I'm a little bit more specialty. So that might be something that is eventually in my career path, and that I think a lot of people talk about. I'm sure you guys have heard, or maybe not here, but I'm sure this series has done some bits on like consulting, and it's a very vague term. So it's hard. It's not so different than what I do currently day to day, but the structure would look quite different. I have two young kids. I'm looking like stability really matters to me right now. A little bit back to your question, Ian. I don't know if that would have mattered right coming out of school. I might have, if I knew I wanted to do biotech, I might have just gone and like shoot your shot and take a job. And if I don't like it after 2 years, apply to go back to school. Um, LabCorp, we fund people to go back for master's degrees. We've had people who have done that. So sometimes getting into a company that will pay for that, or doing 2 years of experience and then thinking, nah, not for me. I'm going to go apply for grad schools. Grad schools will still like accept people. And that's different field, but that's what my husband did, was work for a few years and then go back to grad school. Um, at this stage in my life, like stability really matters, predictability really matters. And so that can change over years. I'm terrible at giving short answers. I'm very sorry, everybody. But yes, I potentially would consider independent consulting, but I'd have to find a buddy. I'd have to find someone to do the sales piece for me.
All right, we have a question from Jocelyn. She says, I'm a junior at USC, and it has been really hard to decide what to do in terms of my career. I kind of like everything, which makes it so hard to decide. This seminar was so insightful and definitely helped with my stress. Thank you for much. Thank you for knowing, with my stress, knowing that everyone has their own path. Good heavens, I can't read. So not necessarily a question, but just a thank you to you. I should have read the
Yeah,
before I said
I
it.
think it's so tough, and it's especially it's been a weird couple of years, right? As you guys have experienced, and biotech in particular has seen a lot of ups and downs. So I think it's totally okay to feel stressed, right? Am I going to be able to get a job? Is that job going to put me on the right path? All those sorts of things. And so I don't want to minimize that. Like, can I get a job? We'll be at the right path is totally fair. I think hopefully people move a lot in biotech. They move companies, they move from like lab to sales, all those sorts of things. So if anything I can say can reduce your stress, yes, everyone has their own path. There's no one right way to do it. And like you can move. You can make different choices. You can like adjust on all of that. So hopefully don't let that like I am sort of a rarity that I've picked one company and that I've been here for so long. I have lots of other colleagues who've moved around departments or moved around companies, and that's much more common. So I also kind of liked everything. The only other thing I can say is think about what you like day to day. You know, if there's things that you can pick out, that writing piece for me was really helpful. That I knew I really liked those writing elements, which was unusual. A lot of other scientists didn't, and so sometimes that can help you decide. But good luck.
Aiden, you have a question.
Yeah, not really much like a question, but I just wanted to kind of share my insight because I'm a junior right now at USC studying biotech, and I would say like the major is kind of crazy because we're taking a lot of business classes, a lot of entrepreneurship classes alongside like your main Gen Bio, Gen Chem, Organic Chem, and like you're exposed to so many fields and industries that I don't really know what I want to go into yet. And I think right now it's it's like middle of spring semester and I still don't have anything lined up for the summer. And it's looking honestly kind of grim because um I'm heavily considering like a master's degree now in either like finance or healthcare consulting. But honestly, I'm not sure what I want to go into. And I don't think a master's degree would help as much as I think just work experience and getting to know how to interact with people.
Yeah. You know, it is easier to move from something more science-based into the business side than vice versa. So it's possible both ways, but I frequently see people who start out in a lab type job or like the toxicology kind of like study support or something, and then they go to project management or they go to sales or they go to something like that. I see that more commonly than the reverse. I think there's certainly a bias and expectation that the science is harder to learn and so it's easier to kind of pick up the business piece. I don't know if that's actually true, but I think there's something of that like perspective. And so I would say if you're unsure, and I mean, if you have the flexibility, right? Sometimes you're like, I need a job or I need to pick a program or that sort of thing, then pursue a little bit more of that science side of the biotech because it can be a little easier to shift into the business pieces. Um, yeah, it's tough. I mean, I never recommend grad school just as a I'm not sure what else to do because I do think you can get that work experience. You might find a company that would pay for your master's, those sorts of things. Um, I maybe take comfort in the fact that there are so many options. That probably doesn't feel good to you right at the moment because it feels more overwhelming than like there are lots of possibilities. But yeah, that's the best sort of advice I can give.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm heavily interested to immunology, in particular like asthma and eczema studies. And I think like quickly in the field of biotech, there's a lot of like growing therapies for immunology.
It's
And it's like something I do want to pursue, but PhD is a bit too long for me. And I don't think I have that type of runway to um like pursue something for that long.
Yeah,
That
there's
might be my
definitely
thought.
immunology is a massively growing field. I mean, you saw those numbers of 7 years ago, our department was 80 people. It's a lot to do with how people are designing therapies. And we could spend another hour talking about that and where the field of like therapeutic development has gone. But yes, there's a lot that is in that immunology space. So, I mean, I think if that's an interest, right, like if you can take a class in the more of that vein, or just, gear some of your, if you have elective projects or things you can do as part of your classes, gear them a little bit toward that. And also there are lots and lots and lots of biotechs that have immunology elements. So just trying to get your foot in the door somewhere. And if it's not the right fit, change. But see if you can find something that has a little bit more of that immunology bent.
Anyway, I appreciate the talk today. It's really like something kind of going through. So it's good to hear that I'm not alone. This journey.
Well, we are sadly at the end of our time. Again, we want to thank you, Amanda, for your time, for your wise words, for being here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. So to the students, this recording will be made available on the Dornsife Career Pathways YouTube channel. I should have it up by Monday. If you're listening to this in the future, then you're already watching it. So congratulations, you made it. If you have any questions or want to reach out to Amanda, feel free to shoot me an email. It is at Folger, Foulger at usc.edu, and I'll get you connected with Amanda. So thank you all for your time and fight on.